For everyone joining us today for a session on assessing the European Accessibility Act. What is the impact several months later? With David Swallow, who will introduce himself just shortly. Before we dive in, just want to go through a few housekeeping items first. The session is being recorded, and we will email this out to everyone after the event once captions have been transcribed and added. Live captions are available if you choose to enable them through Zoom. And lastly, at the end of the session, if we do have time, we'll try to get through as many Q&A, the Q&A portion of the session. Please add your questions to the Q&A functionality within Zoom. It just makes it easy just for us to track and make sure we can get to all the questions that you might have. We sent the slide deck out this morning. We'll also send it out once we send out the on-demand recording. With that, I will pass it to David.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. Today, we're going to take a look at where we really are several months after the European Accessibility Act deadline. What's working, what's unclear, and what we're learning along the way. My name is David Swallow. I'm Principal UX Consultant at TPGI. I'm also joined by my colleague Mitchell Evan, who has been heavily engaged with the European standards process and will be lending support and, crucially, helping to answer any tricky questions. So, cast your minds back to the 28th of June this year. It was a weekend. What a day that was. Incredible scenes. I'm sure you all remember the street parties, the fireworks, the joyous celebrations as Europe became fully accessible overnight. Now, of course, that didn't happen because the 28th of June wasn't an ending, and it wasn't really a beginning either. It was a waypoint on a much longer journey that's still very much unfolding. And what's already becoming clear several months on is that the EAA's impact isn't defined by that single date. It's defined by how organizations and authorities and the accessibility community are responding to the realities that follow. So exactly 150 days on since that deadline, let's look at what the landscape actually looks like now. Now, unsurprisingly, we didn't see a wave of organizations magically becoming compliant overnight. What we're seeing instead is a much more mixed and more interesting picture. So first of all, readiness is all over the place. We're seeing a real spread in EAA readiness across organizations. Some clients already have well-established accessibility programs and have taken the EAA in their stride. They're fully engaged, they're eager for the latest version of the standard, and they're able to integrate the EAA requirements naturally into their existing processes. But many others are still working out what the EAA actually demands. And that uncertainty isn't always about the requirements themselves. In quite a few cases, organizations are still trying to work out whether the EAA even applies to them. So just a reminder, the Act doesn't cover everything. It applies to a specific set of consumer-facing products and services. So on the product side, that includes things like computers and operating systems, smartphones and tablets, self-service kiosks, ATMs, ticket machines, e-readers and similar digital devices, routers and some telecoms equipment. And then on the services side, the big ones are e-commerce, banking services, transport booking and check-in, telecoms and electronic communication services, e-books and e-readers, video on-demand services and emergency communications. Public sector services fall under the existing web accessibility directives, but many organizations operate across both, which is where confusion often arises. So we say readiness varies. Part of that picture is organizations still figuring out whether they're even in scope. And for some, that realization is happening months after the deadline. And this is especially true in more complex scenarios. For example, we had one where an app is developed by one company, it runs on a kiosk produced by another company, and it's then deployed by a third. So who counts as the economic operator in that situation? And it's these sort of edge cases that raise some genuinely challenging questions. TPGI's EAA readiness service has been instrumental here, helping clients unpack these issues and understand where they stand, both legally and practically. Second, end user action is already increasing. So anecdotally, end user action appears to be increasing under the EAA, potentially at a higher rate than we saw under the Web Accessibility Directive. So this includes things like reporting inaccessible websites and apps, submitting feedback to organizations about inaccessible products, requesting alternative formats, and using official complaint channels or contacting national accessibility bodies to escalate unresolved issues. So if this is true, it shows that awareness and expectations are growing and people are starting to assert their rights. Third, there's still an information gap. So even though the EAA has now taken effect, awareness isn't uniform, isn't consistent across the EU. Some member states have been very active in promoting the legislation, while others have been noticeably quieter. And that means many people with disabilities may not even know about the new rights and protections that the EAA gives them. Things like the right to access digital services and the ability to raise complaints and having organizations take responsibility for fixing accessibility barriers. But there are positive signs. The European Commission's Accessible EU initiative is building real capacity, acting as a central resource hub and running training, networking, and awareness raising activities. We're also seeing strong civil society involvement. So the European Disability Forum has been especially active, analysing gaps in national transposition, publishing guidance for user organisations, and pushing for consistent enforcement across member states. They've been one of the main voices highlighting where implementation is lagging and where users are still struggling to understand their rights. On the national level, countries like Germany have published clear guidance, FAQs, and webinars to help organizations understand what the legislation actually requires. In Luxembourg, the National Accessibility Office isn't just enforcing the rules, it's actively educating the public and supporting organizations throughout the transition. So the picture is mixed. The momentum is there, but the awareness gap is still real. And this is exactly where organizations need support, not only to comply with the EAA, but to communicate clearly so people actually understand the rights they now have. And then fourth, national authorities are moving at very different speeds. So some countries are well ahead. They're already building dedicated accessibility teams, they're publishing guidance tools, they're running training programs, they're planning formal monitoring cycles. Others are just starting out. They're still drafting job descriptions, they're figuring out responsibilities, or they're setting up their first advisory committees. And so what this means is the landscape isn't chaotic, but it's definitely not uniform. Every member state is moving forward, just at slightly different paces. So for end users, this can affect things like how quickly complaints can be resolved or what guidance is available to organizations and how easily the public can find information about their accessibility rights. Now, one of the biggest sources of uncertainty right now is the status of EN 301549, the technical standard that underpins compliance for the EAA, the Web Accessibility Directive, and public procurement. So version 4 is still not out. Currently, as of November 2025, it's under review by market surveillance authorities in the EU countries. The expected publication date is not until May 2026, and the expected legal adoption is not until September 2026. So yes, the standard that organizations are expected to follow to comply with the EAA is still being finalized well after the EAA implementation deadline. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing to go on. Many authorities, including us at TPGI, are advising companies to align with WCAG 2.2 level AA and the current EN 301549 version 3.2, informed by changes in the new version 4 and even the EAA text itself. But others are hesitant to give specifics until that new version is locked in. And this is where the delay has real consequences. So from a client perspective, it doesn't look great when we have to hedge our advice. So clauses might change, guidance might shift, and no one can say with certainty how a particular requirement will be interpreted. And I think it's also sapped some of the momentum that was building around that EAA implementation date. I think it's very easy for organizations to think the standard isn't ready, so why should we be? I'd be curious to know what you think about that. That said, the organizations that are truly leading the way aren't waiting for the standards to be finalized. At various meetings and webinars and conferences and things I've attended, the consistent advice from experts is just start taking action now. And practical steps can include involving users early to ensure solutions meet real needs, starting small and building momentum, perform accessibility gap analyses, adopted accessible design systems and secure management sponsorship, focus on awareness and education and culture, embed accessibility into processes, teams and governance, and treat accessibility as an outcome, not a checklist. Engage engineers and designers, use tooling effectively, and include accessibility from the very beginning. All the sorts of things that we advocate for and encourage as accessibility professionals. The organizations that do this are building lasting accessibility rather than waiting for the standard to catch up. A useful reference for organizations thinking proactively is EN 17161, the Design for All standard. So this is a European standard that promotes design for all. It's a principle for creating products and goods and services that are accessible to the widest possible range of users, including those with disabilities. It provides organizations with requirements and guidelines to integrate accessibility into their processes from the initial design stages to the final product or service. So again, this isn't about ticking compliance boxes, it's about building accessibility in from the start. Now, just let me quickly run through some of the key changes coming in EN 301549 version 4, so the version that will eventually sit behind the EAA. So first of all, the standard updates its foundation. So where version 3 was built on WCAG 2.1, version 4 moves to WCAG 2.2 and aligns with the WCAG 2 ICT work, which provides guidance on how to apply the web accessibility guidelines to non-web technologies. And that alignment matters because it brings much clearer coverage of non-web software and documents, which are a huge part of the EAA's scope. Second, functional performance criteria, which were advisory only in version 3, become mandatory. And that shift is important. It gives organizations a formal mechanism to document how a product supports people with disabilities in cases where the more prescriptive clauses don't cleanly apply. It's a bit of a safety net. Third, several major clauses that organizations rely on have been rewritten or significantly revised. So, for example, real-time communications, which was clause 6, has been entirely rewritten, now aligns with a set of newer, more modern telecom standards. For video players, the updated clause 7 sharpens expectations around things like subtitle presentation and spoken subtitles. So subtitle presentation covers how players display and synchronize and preserve and allow users to customize subtitles. Spoken subtitles are audio tracks that read out subtitles aloud, usually provided alongside interlingual subtitles. So you might have a French film with English on-screen subtitles and an English spoken subtitle audio track. Next, for stationary ICT such as kiosks, the revisions bring the standard closer to international requirements, including the US ADA design standard. And this is a welcome change for organizations working across multiple markets. Software user preferences, so clause 11.7 has also been revised. The ones we'll see interpretation challenges remain. And product and service information, which was documented in clause 12, has also been revised and beefed up there. There's also new requirements, for example, new clauses on media program guides. These are areas not covered in version 3, and a wholesale rewrite of communication relay services, again, to align with modern standards and with the EAA. Overall, what version 4 represents is a tightening and modernization of EN 301.549. Many clauses become clearer, broader, or more aligned with global accessibility expectations, which should ultimately make compliance more consistent across the EU and beyond. Now, one thing that often gets overlooked is that the EAA isn't just about EN 301.549. Behind the scenes, the European Commission also issues what's called a standardization request, essentially a mandate that tells the ESOs, the European Standardization Organizations, what supporting standards need to be created or updated to make the law workable. In this case, the Commission's request, mandate M587, asks for several new standards and revisions to ensure accessibility is covered in areas that fall outside of the traditional digital-only requirements. So alongside the EN 301.549 update, we're also seeing work on non-digital information. So a brand new standard to cover accessibility of information that isn't delivered through a screen. So things like printed materials, packaging, instructions, and other physical formats that still need to be usable by people with disabilities. Support services. So another new standard covering the accessibility of customer support routes. So phone lines, help desks, live chat, repair services, installation services. It's recognition that accessibility doesn't stop at the product. The support around it also needs to function for everyone. Emergency communications. So a new accessibility standard aligned with the European emergency communication requirements, ensuring that in an emergency, people with disabilities can reach help, share information, and receive alerts in a usable format. There's a revised EN 17161 Design for All, as I've just mentioned. That gives that framework for building accessibility into organizational processes. And there's a revised EN 17210 Built Environment. So this is updated guidance for making physical environments accessible. So buildings, transport hubs, public spaces, now better aligned with the EAA's broader expectations around access. So while EN 301.549 tends to get all the attention, these supporting standards will fill in the gaps. They make sure the EAA doesn't only cover digital interfaces, but the full ecosystem, products, information, support, and the environments in which everything is used. Now, when it comes to monitoring and surveillance, member states across Europe, again, are taking very different approaches. So some are relying mainly on automated tools, which, as we know, useful for spotting for issues at scale, but not enough to give a full picture. Others combine automation with manual testing and involve people with disabilities. widely regarded as the most thorough approach, the gold standard of accessibility testing, and the model that was established under the prior Web Accessibility Directive. Early surveillance centered on economic operators, and regulators are already taking practical action rather than just issuing guidance. For example, the Swedish regulator PTS, and I won't attempt to pronounce what that stands for, has launched a market control program to inspect laptops and smartphones and tablets for accessibility compliance. They're checking EU declarations of conformity and reviewing how digital product information is presented, including whether that information is accessible. So under the EAA, organizations are expected to self-declare conformity for their products and services and report any non-conformance or formal exceptions, for example, where compliance would impose a disproportionate burden to the relevant national authorities. And these declarations and reports are documented and may be reviewed during market surveillance. Meanwhile, countries like Germany and France have established dedicated enforcement bodies. There's the MLBF in Germany, which I believe stands or translates to the Market Surveillance Authority of the Federal States for the accessibility of products and services, and the DGCCRF in France, and I won't attempt to translate that. Public-facing education and complaint handling mechanisms are also developing, but again, at very different rates across Europe. Now, we're already seeing early enforcement activity, most visibly in France, where two national advocacy groups have taken action against four major retailers. And please forgive my pronunciation here. Auchan, Carrefour, Leclerc, and Picard. On 7th of July 2025, the associations APDV and Droit Pluriel, sorry, supported by the legal collective Intérêt à Asia, issued formal notices mise en demeure to these companies. Sorry. Their arguments is clear. The retailers' websites and mobile apps remain significantly inaccessible to people who are blind or have low vision, with missing alternative text, poor keyboard support, and inconsistent structure. And the companies were given until the 1st of September 2025 to make substantial improvements or face legal action. In November 2025, the case escalated where the associations filed a référé, an urgent court procedure. Crucially, the claim goes beyond compliance. They describe the situation as discrimination numérique, digital discrimination, arguing that inaccessible services undermine people's autonomy online. So for many, these aren't minor obstacles. They prevent basic tasks like completing a purchase. So under France's national transposition timeline, these organizations had around 2 years to prepare. And the associations argue that progress still hasn't matched the scale of the requirements. So why this matters? These retailers were among those selected for inspection, though authorities don't always explain why particular businesses are chosen. The case shows that accessibility scrutiny applies across the board, regardless of size or resources. The outcome may set a precedent. A court ruling could prompt similar action in other countries or other sectors. And it reinforces that accessibility failures are rights-based issues, not just technical non-compliance. And in terms of the EU-wide context, because enforcement sits with each member state, organizations operating across Europe may face separate enforcement routes in each country, each with its own timelines and procedures and expectations. And this variation creates some uncertainty, but it also highlights why proactive accessibility work reduces both legal and operational risk. And a final point here, for enforcement to function fairly, the complaint pathway themselves must be accessible. So if people can't easily report issues, their legal protections fall away in practice. Strengthening accessibility now not only reduces the likelihood of complaints, it also ensures that people relying on these services can use those protections when they need them. Now, procurement is also one of the areas where the EAA has a very immediate practical effect. It's one of the few areas where accessibility obligations are already well structured. So under both the EAA and the Web Accessibility Directive, EN 301549 sits at the centre of public sector ICT procurement. It isn't a nice to have reference. It's the benchmark that buyers are expected to use when evaluating digital products and services. To support that, Etsy has published two helpful technical reports. There's TR 101551, written for buyers, translating accessibility principles into practical tender requirements, and TR 101552, written for suppliers, explaining what evidence they need to provide to demonstrate conformance. And these two technical reports are being merged now into the new version of TR 101551, due to be published in January 2026. So what's encouraging is that the organisations doing this well aren't limiting themselves to the statement, must comply with EN 31549. They're going deeper than that. They're defining the key user journeys the product has to support. They're describing the outcomes they expect people with disabilities to experience, and they're spelling out when and how suppliers will demonstrate this, often with user involvement as part of the evidence. A line we heard recently, which really rings true, is the cheapest accessibility investment you can make is holding your suppliers to account. And we're seeing more procurement teams take that seriously, not because of pressure from lawyers, but because it gives them a clear, reliable way to build accessibility expectations in from day one. Now, one of the shifts that the EAA brings is scale. It reaches beyond the public sector and into mainstream consumer-facing products and services, which means suppliers can't treat accessibility as something that only matters when a government contract appears. Accessibility expectations now sit across a much broader part of the market. There's also a compliance angle. So supplier declarations, accessibility documentation, and the evidence behind them now sit inside a regulated framework. So if those claims turn out to be inaccurate, that can carry consequences. So accuracy matters in a way that it perhaps always hasn't done before. And this isn't theoretical. In several of the early enforcement cases, including those in France, procurement oversight has been identified as a contributing factor. So suppliers had declared that their products or service were accessible, but organizations hadn't verified those claims, and regulators quickly uncovered gaps. It's a useful reminder that procurement decisions directly influence how accessible a product or service will be in practice. Now, let's have a look at some friction points that are becoming clear. So, interpretation differences. So, different member states have read parts of EN 301549 version 3, the current existing version, differently. A prime example is 11.7 user preferences, which is about respecting accessibility platform settings. I've discussed this very clause at IAAP EU meetings over the past couple of years, where we went to long conversations about it. I know Mitchell had lots of discussions about this in the standards groups. It's been rewritten in the latest draft of the standard, but even in its new form, it raises questions about scope and technical feasibility. So we'll watch how the surveillance authorities respond to version 4. The standards are certainly going in the right direction, but the risk from ambiguities like this is inconsistent experiences for end users and compliance costs for cross-border businesses. Plain language guidance. So there's a real need for an official understanding EN 301549 resource, much like the WCAG understanding documents. EN 301549 serves to clarify and make tangible the EAA requirements, and the upcoming version 4 helps to clarify some existing ambiguities, but it's still a technical standard and still requires some degree of interpretation. Yes, there are various unofficial interpretations and help guides out there, but something official would Be nice. Organizations need guidance that's practical and easier to use and more accessible to non-engineers. Participation challenges. So participation is improving with some ESOs as European standardization organizations opening up visibility in processes, but some practical barriers remain. There's a use of long, dense Word documents that are difficult to navigate and crash your computer when you open them. Short review windows, limited accessibility of documents, and limited support for people with disabilities to participate consistently. So in other words, the standards for accessibility isn't always accessible to the people it affects the most. Another point of friction is industry adaptation. So the accessibility industry's remit is expanding, not just web and apps anymore, but also hardware and documentation and support channels and training and reporting and internal governance. And this expansion is something that we've seen a lot at TPGI with our clients, particularly when it comes to hardware and kiosks. Some organizations, particularly those already doing VPAT, VPAT reporting, they're used to extra documentation and compliance requirements, but for many others, these expanded obligations represent a significant leap. The EAA is pushing companies to think broadly about accessibility and rethink processes and coordinate across teams in ways they perhaps haven't had to before. And while this expansion will improve overall accessibility in the long term, it's creating some practical challenges today. And then cross-border coordination, another point of friction. We've heard that a new competent authorities group is forming to improve consistency across member states, which is promising. I'm picturing something like a group WhatsApp. But enforcement remains national, so fragmentation will continue to be a challenge for organizations operating across multiple countries. And if we're talking about sources of friction, let's briefly mention AI, artificial intelligence, a topic that's appeared in almost every meeting and conference this year. And AI keeps coming up in accessibility work, and for good reason. It can be a genuine enabler, things like automated captions, real-time translation, summarized content, personalized assistive features. If used well, it expands access, but also AI can introduce risk. So unpredictable behavior, biased outputs, and results that may be technically accessible but unusable in practice. So none of the benefits are guaranteed. They only emerge if disabled people are involved from the start. A helpful way to think about this came from Ana Carla Pereira at the European Commission, and she compared AI to a library. The data, the underlying data is the book. So is the content high quality? Is it representative? If the book is flawed, the output will be flawed. The algorithm that uses that data is the shelf. So it determines how the book is organized and accessed. And even with good data, a poor algorithm can distort it. And the user experience is how high the shelf is. Can people actually reach the book? If the interface isn't accessible, it doesn't matter how good the data or the algorithm are, the system still excludes people. And as a fourth point, if every library used different kinds of shelves with no common standards, even the best books won't fit. And that's why standards like the EAA matter. Now, where does the EU AI Act fit into this? It's the EU's new framework for artificial intelligence, focusing on transparency and documentation and managing risks that impact people's rights. It doesn't replace accessibility requirements, it supports them, by ensuring AI systems are built and assessed in a structured, accountable way. So the bottom line is that AI doesn't reduce accessibility work. It increases the need for clarity and consistency and inclusive testing. It could be a game changer, but only if disabled people help shape how it's designed and trained and evaluated. So finally, what should organizations actually be doing now? First, don't wait for EN 301.549 version 4. The latest WCAG 2.2 AA and EN 301.549 version 3.2 already give you enough clarity to take meaningful action, especially if you do also incorporate the draft of version 4, which is, it is available. The fundamentals aren't going to change dramatically, so getting started now builds momentum. Second, engage early with your competent authority. These authorities are increasingly active and, by definition, more authoritative than third parties. Their guidance is more reliable than ad hoc materials or second-hand summaries. Third, document your accessibility efforts. So this isn't just bureaucracy or busy work. Good documentation clarifies decisions, it demonstrates intent, it supports defensibility if a complaint arises, and forms the foundations of long-term governance. Fourth, involve users, especially people with disabilities. So they are the best testers you'll ever have. They reveal issues you'll not uncover through automated tools or internal reviews. Their insight shapes solutions that work in real context and aligns with that design for all approach, designing with people, not just for them. Fifth, integrate accessibility across your organization. I don't need to tell you, it's not just the job of a single team. Procurement, product development, training, content, customer support, all have a role to play. The more distributed that it is, the more resilient your accessibility work becomes. Sixth, factor enforcement risk into your planning. So the French case shows that accessibility scrutiny applies across the board, regardless of size or resources. Also, if you operate across multiple EU countries, each may take different enforcement approaches. Another reason to early. Finally, start small, but start now. So gap analyses, accessible design system updates, improvements to content, workflows, and better tooling all help. Momentum matters here more than perfection. So no, there weren't fireworks on the 28th of June, but something better is happening. A growing, messy, imperfect, but very real shift in awareness and expectation and alignment. The EAA isn't a single event or moment. Much like a firework, it's a trajectory. So organizations are all somewhere along that path. Some are highly mature and integrating accessibility into every process. Others are still working out whether and how it applies. And hopefully none of them end this journey in a dazzling explosion. We're already seeing early enforcement signals, including recent cases in France, showing that major organizations are absolutely in scope. Standards like EN 301.549 continue to evolve. Guidance varies and interpretation gaps will take time to close. So what can you do? You can embed accessibility across your organization, involve users early and often, document your decisions, and start acting now. Don't wait for the perfect version of the standard to drop. Because compliance isn't just good user experience, it's risk management, it's reputation management, and most importantly, it's about doing right by users. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening. And yeah, we're happy to take any questions.
And I'll join in here. This is Mitchell Evan. Thanks, David. That was a fantastic overview of the moment we're in and the bigger picture that moment sits in. And it's great. I like how you.
Yeah, there's one.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say there's one question in the chat right now. Do you want to read it out, David, or do you want me to read it out?
I've just seen it.
We can take it.
Yeah. The The initial release of the EAA guidelines almost ignores neurodiversity, gives incomplete guidance for people with cognitive disability, and has nothing related to autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, etc. Will this be addressed in future revisions? There are needs far beyond what WCAG covers. Yes, it's a very good point. Yeah.
David, you've been pretty closely involved in the Web Accessibility Initiative, COGA task force, if I'm not mistaken. I myself am a neurodivergent person. This means a lot, this question. It's the biggest group of people with disabilities is people who are neurodivergent and have cognitive disabilities. And, David, I think as this question was posted early, I had a little bit of time to think about it, and I can give a couple of thoughts. One is that there is a long way to go on the kinds of support that people need. And there are some good precedents. Oh, there is a tiny bit within WCAG and therefore within the European standards which build on WCAG, such as reducing visual and auditory interruptions. That is important. So there's more than none, but it's a tiny slice of what needs to be done. My view is that this is more a technology challenge than a legal problem. If you look from the European Accessibility Act through the UNCRPD, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, there's nothing in these rules that excludes people with cognitive disabilities and neurodivergent. There's nothing that says only some people with disabilities. It's everybody with disabilities. And so I would call on technical leadership, both on the assistive technology development side through communication aids, decision support techniques, that sort of thing, and on the content side, the Web Accessibility Initiative, and to continue their work that's ongoing to create better ways to support people with neurodivergence. When that exists and can point it out as saying, hey, look, there are these successes, then regulations can then start requiring more things, because you can't write a regulation that says do an impossible thing. You have to write a regulation that says do this thing that has been shown to be possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking from the cognitive accessibility group, there have been I don't know if you know that they have a publication making content usable for people with cognitive disabilities. Quite a long-winded title. There've been efforts now to revise that, and they're currently working on a version 2 of that, so updating the guidance there. But that's non-normative. It's only ever supplemental guidance to be used, in addition to WCAG. So the obvious push is to incorporate those kind of requirements into WCAG, and certainly the last 2 versions, 2.1, 2.2, have included requirements that have come from a cognitive background. Certainly might not have turned out quite as they were hoped, but yeah, certainly the impetus, the drive for those came from a cognitive accessibility perspective. Obviously now the focus is on incorporating that into WCAG 3 and looking forward that way. So there certainly are efforts, at least from the WCAG perspective, or the W3C perspective, to incorporate better support for people with cognitive disabilities. It's known about, and people are making those moves. But yeah, you can go much further than that, and some of that will obviously filter through into the broader guidelines like the EA, through them incorporating WCAG and EN 31549. But yeah, there's definitely still a long way to go. Yeah, I don't think that it's an ignorance really. It's a very tricky area as well to address really. And it's such a varied group of requirements really, and satisfying them in a way that suits everyone, can be challenging. So yeah, I think it is on the radar. It's just taken a while to get there.
If other folks have questions, please add them to the Q&A question and answer section. And until we do, I'm going to add one more point to this, which is that personally, I'm a believer in somewhat of a bottom-up approach. So, for example, in Germany, the public sector governments, et cetera, do have a requirement within the country to provide plain language summaries of the key information on government websites. And they mostly do. There's certainly some gaps, but once you've done something, it's hard to prove. You can't say it's impossible because it's been done. So what takes next is the organizing and political will to say, well, Germany did it. Why don't we all do it? And so that's a path. And one final point is just to the fact of the question of, can a future version address this? I think the practical route is that standards have updated faster than the laws. Well, they both have been updated, but the standards that David described well do have had a tempo of every couple of years an update. And so there's opportunities to make sometimes smaller and sometimes larger improvements in those standards. Those opportunities definitely will continue to exist. We do have another question. Will TPGI's ARC system be designating issues when found under the EN 301549? I'm going to take this one. It's smiling. He knows I'm close to this topic. The short answer is yes. We're going to be concentrating more on the version 4 standard. I don't think that's been publicly announced, but that is in fact what's happening right now. And yes, the answer is yes. ARC is including this content.
Okay, any more questions?
None yet, but if there's anyone that has a question, after this session, as you're letting the information sink in, feel free to reach out to info@tpgi.com, and we can connect that with David and Mitchell to react to and respond to. So I just want to thank David and Mitchell for going through this topic and really diving deep into where we were with the fireworks and kind of where we're at now. And hopefully in the next few months we'll have some more insights on the update to version 4. Thank everyone for attending. And again, as always, reach out if you do have questions or you do want to get started on your EDA journey. Feel free to reach out and we can help you. Thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Take care.